Welcome to everybody who has just joined us. Today, I have the great pleasure of chairing this launch event. My name is Richard Mole. I'm a professor at University College London, and I have been using Ruth's ideas for a very long time. So it gives me great pleasure to chair this launch event for her new book which she has written with Markus Rheindorf on identity politics, past and present, political discourses from post-war Austria to the COVID crisis, which is published by Exeter University Press. And so I'd like to thank Exeter University Press for organizing this event. And I'd also like to remind you that you have received a 30% discount with your invitation to this event. So if you buy the book, which I highly recommend you to do, directly from the University of Exeter Press website, you can get a 30% discount. So the way that today's event is going to run is that I will hand over, first of all, to our two authors, to Markus and Ruth. Then we will have comments from our two expert commentators, Joe Angouri and Birgit Sauer. And then I will ask Ruth and Markus to respond to their comments, and then we will open the discussion to everybody present. So I will now do the introductions very briefly before handing over to Ruth and Markus. So Ruth Wodak is Emerita Distinguished Professor of Discourse Studies at Lancaster University. She was awarded the Wittgenstein Prize for Elite Researchers in 1996, an honorary doctorate from the University of Örebro in Sweden in 2010, and an honorary doctorate from Warwick University in 2020. She's a member of the British Academy of Social Sciences and a member of the Academia Europaea. In March 2020, she became honorary member of the Senate of the University of Vienna. She's co-editor of the journals Discourse and Society, Critical Discourse Studies, and Language and Politics. Her recent book publications include The Politics of Fear, The Shameless Normalization of Far-Right Populist Discourses, Sociolinguistic Perspectives on Migration Control, and Europe at the Crossroads. Markus Rheindorf teaches applied linguistics at the University of Vienna and the Central European University, and specializes in critical discourse studies and academic writing. He's received fellowships from the International Center for Cultural Studies and the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His recent publications include Revisiting the Toolbox of Discourse Studies, New Trajectories in Methodology, Open Data, and Visualization. Birgit Sauer is Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Science in the University of Vienna. She was a member of several international research cooperations and projects on gender, migration, racism, and right-wing populism. Recently, she conducted 2 research projects on state transformation and effective governmentality. She was director of the graduate school Gender, Violence, and Agency in the era of globalization at the University of Vienna. Her research fields include right-wing populism and gender, gender and politics, feminist state and democratic theory, politics, affect, and emotions. Recent publications include Worldwide Anti-Gender Mobilization, Right-Wing Contestations of Women's and Gender Rights, and Global Contestation, Governing Affects, Neoliberalism, Neo-Bureaucracies, and Service Work. Joe Angouri is Professor of Sociolinguistics, the university-level academic director for education and internationalization at the University of Warwick, a visiting distinguished professor at Aalto University, the School of Business in Finland, and a visiting professor at Monash University. She's published extensively on leadership, identity, decision-making, and problem-solving, as well as research methodology. She's the author of Culture, Discourse, and the Workplace, and has co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Language, Gender, and Sexuality, as well as Negotiating Boundaries at Work. She's a National Teaching Fellow in the UK and the Subject Chair for Linguistics, Language, Communication and Media on the Scopus Board. So thank you very much to everybody for agreeing to participate this evening. And without further ado, I shall hand over to our two authors. And I believe we'll be starting with Markus to share his views on the topic of the book.
Thank you, Richard, for this very kind introduction. Thank you for everyone for attending this book launch. My apologies initially for my voice. It's probably a bit off. I've got COVID for the second time now. So that's unfortunate, but I'm happy to be here and at least be able to speak. I'd like to begin by giving you a little bit of background on the genesis of the book, so to speak, on why we got together to do this. After having been invited, we were fortunate enough to also get we offered the possibility to do some fresh research, which we were hoping would pull together several different strands of our separate and collaborative work in the past. Support from the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, so a big debt of gratitude goes to them as well at this point. That fresh research, that was the plan, would have tied together those different strands of research on political communication, and particularly nationalist politics and politics of national identity, in a way that unfortunately became impossible due to COVID. So it's sort of fitting that at the moment COVID is again trying to interfere personally, with me at least. But though an obstacle, it did not become a stumbling block to us writing and finishing the book. We found other ways of investigating political communication under these new circumstances. So the underlying aim and objective, or objectives in the plural of the book, did change a bit. They were still the overarching aim of finding a way of tying together salient and recent work that we had done and were doing from the discourse analytical perspective on the political in the widest sense, from professional politics to politicized topics outside the professional field of politics. We did this in the, as I remember it, in the full knowledge and deliberately that these would be strands going off in quite different directions, using different methodologies, sometimes overlapping as well, and using quite different sets of data. To me, that was actually an advantage. That to me has always looked like a strength, a richness in the work of discourse analysis, particularly critical discourse studies. And it's been something that for the last 10, 15 years, I've been actively pursuing and trying to elaborate on, to experiment with even, if you pardon the word, to discover, it's a strong word, but to discover those potentials that we can glean from actually embracing an understanding of discourse as not just linguistic, even if we are, Ruth and I are in some sense linguists at heart, but to embrace a wider definition or understanding of discourse that includes social practices of all sorts, meaning-making practices of all sorts. Another aspect where the book, I think, shows its strength in the diversity of the different chapters and approaches is the kinds of material that we work with. Data ranging from speeches, party manifestos, to pop music, or let's just say music album covers, and songs and anthems and YouTube videos. Here, however, there is one loss that I still regret, that was caused by COVID, which would have been very much bottom-up, grassroots political initiatives that were just starting up when COVID happened, in Austria, in Vienna specifically, that we were planning to study and bring together. So I'll end on that note. That's something that we wanted to do and would still like to do, although the situation has, of course, completely changed. At the time, we saw it as an interesting, not contradiction, but an interesting field of tension. In German, we would say Spannungsbogen. A field of tension between the very strictly managed message control by then Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, and these very local grassroots political initiatives that were springing up, starting to organize in a new way. Also using social media, but they weren't restricted to social media. They're very local in the old-fashioned sense of the word local. Districts, smaller than districts, neighborhoods even, with people organizing around political issues. So I'll end on that note. Something that could have happened and that still is calling out to happen. And hand over to Ruth.
Yeah, thank you very much, Markus. Thank you, Richard, for moderating this panel, and Joe and Birgit for participating. And it's a huge pleasure to see many friends online, which I haven't seen for a long time, or some of them I have actually seen in Vienna, but some of them are far away. And in spite of these strange times, Zoom makes it possible to meet up and link, at least in this strange way, but allows face-to-face communication, which does help cope with the isolation and the strange proximity distancing measures we are all confronted with. I would also just like very briefly to introduce the contents of our book, but first to just list some important topics which run through the book. And as Markus has said, we weren't able to really do field work, which we would have loved to do as sociolinguists. But on the other hand, we were able to analyze and study crisis communication. So the last chapter in this book, if I start from behind, is about the nationalizing and renationalizing crisis communication, which happened in Austria, but not only in Austria, of course, and how in times of uncertainty, going back to national borders, to closing borders seems to be a way out, a coping way with fear and uncertainty. On the other hand, apart from an introductory chapter on nationalisms and discourse studies as such, with a focus on the discourse historical approach, which is then elaborated in the second chapter by Markus, especially focusing also on some quantitative approaches, something critical discourse studies haven't been so happy with, but I think we have managed, and this is something new in this book, to innovate methodologies as well, and to show a way forward in coping with the historical dimension, both historical on a short term, meaning a couple of months or so, but historical also in long term, because we have 2 chapters about rewriting the past, as this project from where all these different publications stem from, and also our new chapters, was a project which we conducted together with Rudi de Cilia and Sabine Lehner on Austrian identities 1995 to 2015. There were 3 projects in sum. And this kind of longitudinal dimension, where on the one hand, certain data were standardized, commemorative data, which didn't change, like when was the Republic founded, when was the concentration camp Mauthausen liberated, when did the State Treaty of Austria was declared on 15 May 1955, and so forth. They are commemorated every year, but of course in decades we were able to trace changes, discursive shifts or discourse changes, which we discuss, all this terminology as well, in different data, as Markus has already mentioned, from discussion groups, focus groups, to online media, to traditional media, posters, parliamentary debates, speeches, etc. So there's a plethora of data which all need different methods. And it's always difficult to integrate those methods, but keep going with the topics. And I do hope that we succeeded, but that's of course something up to the readers. Another important issue, and it has become even more important now, is that we studied the refugee movement 2015-16 as part of this project, and part of a workshop which was conducted at the European University Institute at Florence, and was published in a special issue in the Journal of Refugee and Immigrant Studies, where we traced in the media debates about the refugees entering Austria, being rejected, being welcomed, being denied, and the complete turnaround in the mood towards those refugees. And now that really calls for a new book, or at least some papers. We have a second, much bigger refugee movement coming from the Ukraine, where there are salient differences already to be noticed, even without doing a study of how these new refugees, there are much more, there are already 4 million people displaced, and about, I think, 60,000 or 50,000 which have reached Austria up to date. I'm not sure about the number, as it changes every day. But how these refugees, being labeled as neighbors of us, are being welcomed. And even though some people, especially students, are coming from third world countries who have studied in the Ukraine, they are treated differently than the Ukrainians who are obviously white and Christian. There are also other differences which we might discuss. So this is, I think, a topic which makes it very topical, this book, because it allows a certain foundation for a comparison which is to be done. And thirdly, I want to mention 2 more points. Gender politics, not only because Birgit is on board and we have quoted her extensively with her fantastic work, but because gender politics has become a contested terrain in far-right populism and far-right debates, but also conservative mainstream debates. And Richard has been conducting a project on this populism, where I have had the honor to be on the advisory board. So gender politics might be seen really as metonymic for many debates which we are confronted with between, let's say, old values, turning the clock back, and a Europe of diversity and a world of diversity. And finally, a point which we also made in one of our, two of our chapters, is the point of normalization of how the mainstream parties are drifting ever more to the right, and how social conservative, national conservative parties have swallowed the far right agenda, especially in asylum and migration policies, but also in gender and educational policies, and how the political landscape has changed and been accepted. We used the example of Austria, specifically the Conservative Party under former Chancellor Kurz. Of course, much has happened in between. He's not Chancellor anymore. We have the third Chancellor now in several months. But his agenda have certainly marked Austrian politics in a specific way. And we might also speculate, can one turn the clock back here, or are these nationalizing tendencies going forward? And I would like to stop here, and I'm very curious what our commentators are going to say.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Markus. Joe or Birgit, which one of you would like to respond first?
I don't mind, Joe, if you would like to.
Either, same. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want me to start? Do you want to go first? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I can start. That's a very sort of kind of a nice demonstration of politeness negotiation or Monty Pythonian moment. But anyway, thank you very much. It's it is absolutely a privilege and a pleasure to be here today, and it's so timely, and to me it's actually so important, because this conversation, of course, it starts as a response and reaction to this really great, significant and timely work, but also has such an important relevance about what is it we are doing collectively with our work, what it is that we want to see as a contribution to the very complex and changing world around us, and how we can actually make our work as part of the solution, or at least contributing to what we could be sort of providing something towards. I mean, so we know that there will be never a solution. I think that's what this book shows, but it's how we actually make our work more relevant. And I think that was something that I very much really liked, what both Markus and Ruth said as the aspiration and the motivation behind the work, but also the need really for rediscovering and reconnecting and recontextualizing what we do, experimenting, but also reconsidering how what we have been writing and what we've been saying in our own spheres have not necessarily, and do not always sort of communicate, do not always go beyond. I think I have a number of various different notes, and I've given 5 minutes. I just wanted to overall say that I found really, in a sense, COVID, of course, changed the way that this book would have been written, but equally, in a sense, it sort of gave this reflection of the old and the new, and I really very much enjoyed looking into from different perspectives, and myself considering the need for a different model of handling and dealing and interpreting data, and understanding the interconnections of the sort of small p and capital P politics, and how we actually see these intersections. And I think bringing together, having this collection is a really very important springboard for that. So I really enjoyed it. I think it actually, what to me has been a very important one was that this book almost was a kind of, it sort of gave me a kind of an overview of the history of our change in terms of the way we think, the way we've explored, the way we've applied methodologies, and the way we actually brought together the sort of the discursive, the political sciences, and in a sense that to me is also very important in terms of the intersectionality that I think is something that in a sense we can collectively reflect on, and the book really shows, but also the interdisciplinarity. I would like to talk a little bit more sort of for a few minutes later on that, because we have been writing and Ruth's work has been so influential on understanding social practice, understanding discursive construction of crisis in a way that are processes of abstraction and processes of meta-narration. And I found certain parts of the book about reflecting on issues of representation, so whose stories, whose voices become the norm, and how what has been marked not that long ago. So in a sense, it's very interesting to see the fast pace of change, and that is also quite scary in a way, and how it is becoming normalized, and it is becoming normalized in the discourse of the sort of the political parties, and Ruth has very sort of already given an overview of that, but also it's being normalized in the discourse of various bodies that that have as their purpose to support sort of integration, equality, sort of distribution of opportunity and so on. And we actually see that the narratives and often the discourses that perpetuate there are also recreate those deep distinctions between us and them, which actually make things very, very blurred. And I think Ruth already, as always Ruth does, put her finger on the kind of the discourses around refugees as neighbors. And I'm currently taking this call from Duke in North Carolina, and in a sense has been really interesting in the last couple of days to talk to taxi drivers in different parts of the US, to talk to the sort of non-experts about the interpretation of the war. And I think we actually see the stories and the representation and normalizations of who is one of us, and the sort of privileged sort of discourses that are projected once one can indicate membership, and then how events and statistics are interpreted versus those who are the other, and therefore in a sense something else, something different applies. And I think this kind of rethinking and sort of reflecting how, in a sense, with the tools we have, we can really show this kind of process that this blurriness has happened, and also the kind of time is now also against us, right? So in a sense, because one crisis morphs into another crisis, and in a sense, we have been talking about, of course, crisis as a construct, as sort of a kind of the crisis frames always biases people to include different phenomena in sort of the stories that become the general stories. And I think that's the sort of, for many of us on the call, we have been, we've in the meeting today, we've been trying to actually frame it, but what we actually see, and I think that book really shows, and that would be something that I would invite us to start discussing today and maybe continue, is how things morph one into another. So in a sense, the kind of the COVID to the socioeconomic, to the political, to the geopolitical, to the gender, and through that, in a sense, this normalization of inclusions and exclusions becomes deeper and becomes more and more commonplace and becomes more invisible. So even when the intention is to support or to provide a kind of liberal and open environment, we actually see that the discourses of sort of us and the other are very much there. So I think this kind of concept of reinventing it to me, and sort of reflecting and inviting the reader to reposition the thinking is very, very important for us as a discipline. And I'm not talking about one specific discipline, I'm talking about us here today who actually want to address some of those complex questions. And I know I'm coming to the end of my sort of 5 minutes, but I have some big questions that I think this book raises and provides a very important answer onto the need for experimentation, on the need of revisiting and recontextualizing and repositioning our thinking and what we've been saying in the light of the sort of the very fast changing social world around us, and the fact that we also have to think of the various modalities of the different media, of how all those things become co-constitutive. And of course, we've been talking about each of those things, but the pace of change and the impact and the way we actually see the reaction is sort of really significant. So we are in a space where I think this context, this environment urges to think how are we actually using, what we should be doing differently. And I think that is something that this book is asking, and I think we all need to collectively think as to how we can reposition our work, how the sort of what we have been saying, doing, and so on can be made relevant. We are extremely bad as experts in sort of inverted commas communication or discourse in sort of communicating outside this kind of specific spheres. And of course, we know that what we say often is not what the sort of this hegemonic discourses want to hear. Nevertheless, I don't think we have, with the exception of course, you know, there are colleagues, and I think, Ruth, I would very much like to hear more about what do you think we should be differently, because in a sense, we are not showing, we are not adding to the counter or the anti-narrative. In a sense, we are kind of still are within the family of sort of talking between ourselves, but we need to go beyond that. We need to think of different models. And I think Markus said very much about reinventing and revisiting. We need that. We also need to reinvent what is our political agenda? What is it that we're actually doing? How do we want to make all this sort of work relevant beyond? And part of that is also our own curricula and our own education. And I promise I will stop in sort of 30 seconds, but how are we actually allow and enable our students? And I'm not talking about our PhD students, because often when we start this conversation, we start talking, oh yeah, well, I have a PhD student who is research assistant, or even sort of master's PhD. I'm talking about first year undergraduate students. I'm talking about our core curricula. I'm talking about spaces where our students can really apply all those theories to the complexity, and they can actually see the relevance onto the sort of the moral order of this society that is changing so fast. And how do we actually empower our students to make those connections and synchronize our curricula to the world around us? Because I think what I see is that the link, we often have curricula that are not synchronized both with the problems, the complex problems, but also with the need for a very sort of active approach, so that our students can actually really see the relevance of and the implications and the very sort of significant deep implications of what they're studying. So I think we often talk about how we can communicate and make change out there, but we also need to look in our own house and see what do we do with our programs, what do we do in sort of the way we actually frame, the way we represent those issues in our daily life. I have much more, in a sense that was 1/3 of my notes, but I can actually see Richard will start fidgeting. So my interactional self is telling me that I need to pass on the floor. And I think the kind of these big questions about what we should be doing differently, how we actually reposition and recontextualize our work, how and where we need to really reconnect about the way we imagine, or we can reimagine the way we can sort of transform maybe education, or the kind of education that we have a lot of space to really bring our students much closer to those issues, and to kind of then also think what on this sort of timeline of our own thinking, of our own development, how do we need to take the tools that have enabled us to be where we are, but really think what we need to be doing differently for this reality around us, which is sort of very different to what it was 3-4 years ago. And I think it's a very important point. It's not about going back. It's basically that COVID has been an accelerant for deep inequalities, for what we knew was there. and brought it to the fore. How should we respond? And I think that's my reading of the book, was that it was an invitation really for all of us to think differently. And thank you very much for that. Big questions, but I'm sure they can be answered, or at least we can start this conversation today and really also take it as an opportunity to maybe change the way we communicate between ourselves, how we actually learn from each other in our national contexts, how we can make an impact and difference. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much indeed. So handing over to Birgit now.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this book launch. And first of all, or second, I would like to congratulate the two of you for the book, because I think it it has so many important theoretical, methodological, but also empirical new findings. And I think how you compiled the book, was really exciting for me to read through it. And so what I found funny is that you start in 1995 and you end now. And I came to Austria in 1995. So it's just the time span I've been living in the country. And I somehow realized as an outsider how much the country changed in different directions. And I think we could see the different directions, the tensions between different actors in the countries. So I thought this is really wonderfully reflected in the book. And this is also why I think that Austria is really a great example, for the good or the bad, to show how identity politics worked over these last 30 years something. So I thought this is really very interesting. And I think not by chance you used the title Identity Politics. So maybe this would be something we could discuss later on, because I think it's a very important issue. And well, I talk when I do research on right-wing politics, I talk about masculinist identity politics, just to focus on the fact that there are a lot of political strategies to address males, but also to somehow address what I would call a masculinist constellation in society. And of course, then to restore traditional gender relations, as you pointed out then in the chapter. But nevertheless, at least in the German debate, but also in the US debate, I don't know how it is in the UK, identity politics is very much contested these days. And in the book, in one chapter, you referred or you rejected this pejorative notion of identity politics, referring to Jan Werner Müller and saying, well, but identity politics exists since modern times. It's an important part of forming interest groups. Let's phrase it like that. So maybe we could nevertheless discuss if there are good or bad identity politics, and how can we then distinguish this notion of identity politics. This leads me to another point I would really be interested in discussing, and this was also what Joe pointed on. I found it really, and always when reading your work before, I find it really interesting how your linguistic approach is such a political approach, and often it's much more political than my political scientist colleagues are. So I would like to then link your analysis to the issue of democracy. I think it's a lot of your chapters are, of course, linked to questions of democracy and of a decline or illiberalization of democracy or of anti-democratization processes. And I think what you carve out, these issues of identity, of nationalism and re-nationalization and re-traditionalization and of exclusive solidarity, we could say. And I think this is in the COVID chapter very pertinent. I think we could and should link it to processes of anti-democratization. So the next point I would be interested, and also Joe referred to this, is these what you call crisis mobilization, communication. And I think this is very important. And as we see now today, perhaps more than when you wrote the book chapters, is that all the crises are going to be a sort of new normal. I don't think that we are, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I think there is a lot of what I would say crisis mobilization. So it's not only about the communication, but the crises that are mobilized. And this was especially true for right-wingers. They mobilized the crisis of traditional gender roles, of families, of the nation, of the social order, and so on. So they are very, let's say, familiar what crisis mobilization might look like. But now I think it might be important, if we look at the crisis we are facing now, the war in Ukraine, COVID still going on, but also the environmental catastrophe. I think we should really carefully look at how crises are constructed and mobilized, and to see what, as Joe said, what could be counter strategies? Could it be, I don't know, Chantal Mouffe talks about left-wing populism. Could it be left identity politics? Or I would say also environmental activists. They also mobilize a crisis, a feeling of crisis, just to wake up people to do something. So maybe this could be also something interesting to be discussed. And the last point is more a conceptual point, and this is your notion of normalization, which goes through the book like a sort of a red thread. And when you talk about normalization, as far as I read it, you talk about processes of getting from the margins to the mainstream. And mainly you talk about right-wing tropes, attitudes, and so on, which are picked up by mainstream parties or by mainstream media. Me more coming from a Foucauldian notion of normalization, I would just frame it the other way around, saying, well, there is something normal in society, a sort of normal racism, a sort of normal anti-feminism, which is picked up by specific actors, yeah, and then brought to the fore. But it's not that these right-wing actors invent anti-Semitic narratives. They do not invent anti-feminist narratives, but there is, I don't know how we could call it, a sort of, I don't know, desire to exclude other people. And I would say this has been elaborated during the long 30-something years of neoliberalism. So this would be then another process of normalization, which would not exclude your notion, but which would give your notion a sort of other spin when we look at how discourses are mainstreamed and then are picked up by specific groups of people. So I'll end here, and I'd like to thank you again for this interesting book.
Thank you very much, Birgit. So now hand back to our authors to ask whether they would like to respond to some of the comments from Joe and Birgit before opening to the floor.
Markus, do you want to start?
I'm still thinking, sorry.
Okay, well then, there's so much that I think we will have to sit together and discuss. So I will just pick up, I think, 2 points, which were, or 3, which were addressed from both of you in some ways. First of all, the intersectionality, interdisciplinarity as a characterization of critical discourse studies and our own approach. I think this is very important, that we are problem-oriented, and that distinguishes this critical approach, which doesn't mean negative per se, but just means challenging and not taking anything for granted, not essentializing anything. This invites interdisciplinary or transdisciplinarity immediately, because complex issues cannot really be deconstructed and analyzed and described and interpreted just from one perspective. So this is an old sort of debate, of course, also in linguistics. Is this politics? Is this linguistics? Is this sociolinguistics? What is it? What territoriality do we have? And for me, this is not, I think this is the salience of critical research. And in that way, it can be about political communication, but it could also be about education. It could be about gender. It could be about any other topical field. For me, this has always been the most important way to try to understand at least something of the complexity which we are confronted with, and to understand that as linguists or discourse analysts, we certainly can't answer those difficult questions on our own. So working in teams, working together with colleagues from other disciplines has been most important and inspiring in many ways. The second question, which is linked a bit to this, is the question of how do we empower others? It would be lovely to have recipes. We don't. To get the hegemony, or at least to be heard in the media, is difficult. I mean, both Birgit and I have been heard in Austria. We both have written in newspapers and are invited to various interviews, etc. And it's interesting that through COVID, scholars have been invited much more than they ever have. Natural sciences, of course, medicine, but also others. So that has given a chance to have voices heard. It always depends on joining civil society groups, and do scholars actually take the time to do that or don't? I think this is actually quite an easy question. Right now it's about helping refugees and sort of discussing different forms of help. Do we take time or don't we? Do we just talk about it, or do we do something? And the doing depends on how much time you have, and of course the limitations of the work in our universities. As I'm retired, it's a bit easier, but I know the conditions, especially also in British universities, and to find time and to speak out is not easy in pluralist democracies, which takes me to the question of democracy and normalization. In the chapter about courts and the shameless normalization, I do talk a lot about Hungary and Poland as well. I think it's very important to point to the threats and dangers to pluralist democracies. Democracy is not just voting, it's much more. And we see right now what happens in sort of the dichotomies of us and them, with sort of reviving the Cold War scenarios which we're confronted with, and that the EU is of course not united, but we have big cleavages in the EU which are briefly, superficially being covered up right now, but are of course massive. And in my view, if the EU does not also sanction Hungary and Poland because of the way they deal with press freedom and legislation and etc., then that will point to the end of the European Union. I'm also quite pessimistic, and I agree with you, Birgit, that the new normal is crisis. So we just drop from one crisis to the next. And the normalization, I would never see normalization as being invented by the far right. What the far right does is detaboo conventions. So of course, anti-Semitism has been around for 2000 years and it will always be around. But what the far right has done is detaboo certain limitations, conventions in different public spheres, so you can say things which you couldn't say before, and it's accepted. And that has changed. Also taking agenda such as exclusion of Muslims, or the way of dealing with women and the homophobia in Eastern Europe. Sort of these issues have always been around, but they're now being mobilized. And the normalization means they're coming to the center, and they're supported by the conservative parties, because otherwise they would not be successful. So I think that in that way we don't contradict each other. I see it basically, of course, as not invented and created, but mobilized and also functioning as a catalyst, because you can deal with these catalysts. Yeah, you swear, insult, offend, and you do all these terrible things, and at the same time you implement policies which almost go unnoticed. Yeah, and it's quite a good practice which Donald Trump didn't invent, but implemented a lot of times, and of course has been implemented here as well. So I stop here because there would be so much more to say. I don't want to do that.
Thank you, Ruth. Markus, would you like to add anything?
Yes, my thinking has worked itself out. I was trying to connect a few things, and I think I'd like to sort of briefly respond to the who do we talk to, and how good are we, how bad are we at talking to people about the kind of research we do. And for me personally, career-wise, that's also been the question of, is there space in the curricula of specific departments? Is there space in linguistics for something like critical discourse studies? Very basic fundamental question. If there is no space, that takes away one very important group of people that we can talk to, I hope we know how to talk to, students. And that's just it's so important, because it's a question of multiplication, right? If you can get 10 students a term to write a bachelor or master's and take up some of these ideas, that multiplies. So the second point then actually comes from that teaching, which I've been lucky enough to do for a few years now, and connects it to normalization. I've personally been guilty of focusing so much on the negative normalization from the far right or extreme right, that I've not often noticed the normalization of the opposite, left, progressive, liberal ideas and concepts from academia, that have been quite common, have become commonplace for many young people, students. Not always, of course. So here's the anecdote from teaching, covering the topic of identity politics. I already started the conversation by counterclaiming the negativity into the term, and got a response, a welcome response from a student, but still surprising, that yes, but there's just so many groups these days who are all doing this identity politics that it's too much. It's overwhelming, and I don't want any identity politics because there's so many minorities or so many groups who are all campaigning for their rights, and it's just too much. In fact, that was a very genuine, if questionable response, but it was so genuine that I think I would share that here. Yes, and the final point is just tying this back in with one of the chapters, actually. Normalization again of linguistic practices might also mean, or might be operationalized, as we've done, in the sense of the case is the unwillingness to integrate, where this is a term or a phrase that is used initially or at some point in socially marginal circles, rarely, and then it spreads in terms of frequency, it spreads in terms of diffusing into different social fields. That has been another use for the term normalization, the way we've been using it in a very narrow linguistic sense. It's no longer a word or a term that people raise their eyebrows at.
Thank you very much. So thank you to all of our speakers. I'd now like to give our audience the opportunity to ask questions, and we have one in the chat from Stefan Dollinger, who I would now like to ask to turn on his camera and ask the authors or the other members of the panel your question, please.
Hi, I can't turn on the camera. It's not enabled, it tells me here. Hi, everyone. Hi, Markus. Hi, Ruth. Hi, everyone there. Thank you for the presentation. Thanks for the book. I haven't seen it yet, but I will. But I know your previous work, of course. And so one interesting question that has been keeping me busy is the idea of sort of the reclaiming of certain terms. And I think about Van der Bellen's, the Austrian president's use of Heimat in his ad campaigns to presidential election. That sort of was a bold move to reclaim a term that had been appropriated by the right and is being appropriated for somebody who's clearly a progressive liberal thinker. And I was wondering whether the term nation, and you've been dealing a lot with the national constructions of identity for many years now, whether the term nation would be such a contender. And I'm asking this for the background of hegemonic tendencies, not just in society, but also in the academy, I think, where hegemonic tendencies are, I think, taking on more and more scope in terms of how languages are conceptualized. The idea of pluricentricity was something that was more bandwagon in the 90s and is now sort of being pushed aside. So I was wondering whether you see benefits of sort of reclaiming the term nation as something, as a positive aspect, and then build from it something, like the nation would be a root of a common human tree or something like this, where you actually focus on the positive aspects rather than on the divisive, or whether we don't really need it as some German colleagues sometimes say, or that the term nation is something that's been sort of destroyed in World War II and World War I, and it can no longer be revived. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on the revival, on the reclaiming of the term nation.
I can briefly start, because this is, of course, also a long conversation. but it depends on how you define nation. And if it's about civic nation and civic national identities, which foreground citizenship, and how, again, citizenship is defined, that can be certainly reclaimed. And we see right now in the debate about the Ukraine how it is positively reclaimed, that the Ukraine actually states that they are a civic nation, or that they have this kind of a civic national identity, and how that is defined and when it started and so forth, whereas it's confronted and opposed by a very different kind of meaning of cultural national identity. So yes, I think that is very, very important. And there are several good examples apart from the Heimat, where one of my MA students is just writing about this concept and how it's being reclaimed and debated and contested, is reclaiming spaces. And one really good example also exists in Vienna of reclaiming the Heldenplatz, which is that big square in the center of Vienna, which became very famous because there are many pictures of Hitler marching in to Vienna and riding in and being driven in, and hundreds of thousands of people waving and welcoming him, and it became a very negative image, very negatively connotated. Later on, extreme right dueling fraternities used to meet on that square, and there were actually demonstrations pro and against. And since about 5 years, if I'm not wrong, might be 6, it has become the place where liberation of Vienna from National Socialism and the end of war is celebrated. It's the Fest der Freude, it's the celebration of joy, yeah, and of freedom. And it has been totally reclaimed by civil society and progressive parties. And that is a very interesting trajectory of changing meanings and actually resemioticizing spaces in particular ways.
Thank you.
Markus?
Also perhaps in response and picking up from the example. I think it's an interesting counterexample to the common humanity trajectory, in the sense that it's so local and so specific. And I don't have an answer, but it strikes me that these are two very different directions in which one might go. Maybe we need to go both anyway. But I wonder if sort of this universalizing common humanity thing, I mean, certainly an answer to the particularism of nationalism. I wonder if it's productive. There have been so many issues with it theoretically in the past. Humanism, that is, and there's the pitfalls with essentializing any part of this. I'm just reminded of issues with something I read recently about and this is I don't have a strong position on this, but I recently read about a critique of the human rights project, the entire human rights project, as being premised on establishing stable and fixed identities. And a substantial part of achievements, of liberal achievements, such as asylum rights, also depend on establishing, for example, membership of a particular social group. And that has achieved a lot. But it also creates problems for people who don't have an identifiable and unchanging trait that would allow them to gain access to asylum, such as queer people, where we can't say, well, you need to do this or look like this, otherwise we won't recognize that you're gay. So that's a particular problem, of course, but just to illustrate how there might be a tension between such important and crucial achievements and, I think, theoretical positions that we have become used to, and that are also important. And I don't know if it's a discrepancy or a tension simply between policy and academic theory, or how to address that. So that's just to continue the conversation. It's not an answer.
Yeah, I didn't expect an answer, but you're quite right on that. There's a, like the idea whether the nation is important or not. That's one aspect that I often see, sort of especially in the European context, where intellectuals just don't seem to think about it much, but it has very profound repercussions if you try to file an asylum claim. It's so basic and still determines so many aspects of our lives that I kind of think it's almost like scandalous that it's not theorized on, that it's just brushed aside as something that's thing of the past, and we're all European now, and yeah, this may be the goal, right? It might be the goal. How do you get there? And I don't think it works by considering something irrelevant that for a certain privileged class like academics is often not very relevant, right? At least in the European context. So I think that's one thing that I in a way, yeah, before I kind of speculate too much, I think I'll leave it here. But thanks, Markus. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you. Perhaps have time for one more question, if anybody would like to take the opportunity.
Can I take 30 seconds? If just to ask, because and maybe actually ask some of colleagues who are in the audience, what are the implications? I think we have been so trained to talk about crises, and look into an individual set of phenomena that we're associating, sort of COVID-19, financial crisis, number one of 300, and so on. And we're also saying that we are very much into this sort of space where we are in a constant space where one morphs into another, but equally they're coexistent. So in a sense, one may be foregrounded. And again, I would be very interested in the politics of representation of the crisis. But equally, the kind of one is what parts of what set of phenomena that are bundled together as the crisis that comes then with a label. But then there are also all other that will become or then sort of morph to the next crisis that are co-constitutive, are coexistent. What are the sort of the implications that this has huge implications in a sense, and how we actually capture that sort of that system, and it creates this kind of very amorphous way of bringing local global issues. It requires, yeah.
I think if I may quickly respond, because I think our time is getting over, but just to quickly respond, I think crises are being instrumentalized, and different groups have different interests with mobilizing different crises. And you're quite right. Right now we have a plethora of crises. They're all at the same time, and we don't know when they start and we don't know when they end. And all the criteria Koselleck and Baumann and others have listed are out there, and in that way, different politicians and different parties and different interest groups can instrumentalize different crises and different aspects of the crisis. And interestingly, very much with the politics of fear, very frequently also, for example, the climate crisis is being, of course, mobilized with the politics of fear. And then we can ask, how does that differ from the far right politics of fear? And there are differences, but which we cannot go into now. But of course, that is the point. So I think it's important to detect who mobilizes which crisis or which aspect of a crisis for which gain, for which election, for which whatever. We have experienced in the last 2 years how the pandemic was mobilized in all sorts of ways immediately to cover up all kinds of other inequalities, poverty, big other crises, especially also the climate crisis. So actually it would be interesting to see how these the struggles between interests, yeah, and who has, just as a quick answer, I mean, it's of course, and Birgit probably has much more to say to that from political science aspect, but how those different crises get implemented and policies get debated and who has the power to do what at what time, that seems to me to be what we have to look at, because the crises are out there, but they get used and they get foregrounded and they get backgrounded and so forth. And that's also the entry point, I think, for this discourse analysis.
Fantastic. Don't know, Markus, whether you wanted to have the final word.
Yeah, I'll take it. That reminds me of something that I haven't gone around to yet, but emotions. We might look at, in the instrumentalization of crises, which are the emotions that are they fear, are they anger, hate, or are they caring? Thinking of climate change. Is climate change action? Are we trying to mobilize? Are we trying to activate people through fear, panic, or through caring, for instance? I don't think that for any crisis necessarily they're the main driving emotion. Maybe immediately it's fear, but in the long run, on the policy level, there's other emotions that might be, and that might be a way of distinguishing how and what they're being instrumentalized.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to draw the event to a close now. Rhiannon has posted a link in the chat to the book on the University Press website. Don't forget that you get a discount if you buy it directly from the university. But before I finish, I would just like to thank you again for attending, and then in particular to thank our 4 panelists for their fantastic insights into Ruth and Markus's new book. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, very much.
Yeah.